Other countries that you're looking at right now, I'm guessing names like Saudi Arabia come up, Israel, Iran, Venezuela, what else?
I mean, all of the above.
All the above, okay.
Yeah.
I mean, a list of them,
maybe,
all for different reasons.
Yeah, I mean, no, everyone for different reasons. Maybe one place to start right now, because it's an acute emergency, is Idlib province in northwestern Syria. Okay. And not that many people focus on this, but today, Russian and Syrian bombers are threatening 3 million civilians in Idlib, who are now huddled along the Turkish border, which is closed. And this could become a new refugee crisis because Turkey has already taken in, say, 3.5, almost 4 million refugees. They're not going to take another 3 million without opening up the Aegean, and Europe is going to have a new refugee crisis. Wow. So the stakes are extremely high, not to mention the potential bloodshed on the ground. And the key to stopping this is Putin. Putin can turn it on and off at his will. But European governments have not really been talking about this very much. And they are, kind of staring a disaster in the face unless they act and put pressure on Putin. So that's a big issue right now that is not getting the attention that it needs. Erdogan, the Turkish president, is making some effort to stop this advance, but he's very much alone. And there's surprisingly little European support to him.
Okay, and Putin's and the Syrian are bombing some of these areas?
Exactly.
Right, the New York Times has done some articles proving that they bombed hospitals. And
yes, that's how they do it. This bombing, it's either indiscriminately across civilian areas, or where they get targeted, they bomb hospitals. And the hospitals are literally underground to try to protect
That blew
themselves.
my mind. So they build them underground.
They build them underground. And what they were doing is they were sharing the coordinates with the UN as a form of protection. The UN would then give them to the warring parties, and Russia would use these as target lists.
And they do that because they're going to squeeze Europe with this crisis. It's always maybe a political reason.
Well, Russia would be happy for Europe to have a refugee crisis because that's how its allies rise. I mean, why is Viktor Orban pursuing his so-called illiberal democracy in Hungary? It's by fighting against this influx of migrants and asylum seekers. And so Russia actually would love to have another refugee crisis in the West, but they also want things from the West. They want Ukraine sanctions lifted. They want ordinary economic relations. And so the West has considerable leverage there. It's just not using it.
Right. Because a lot of people say, why would they bomb hospitals? But they do it because this is all a political chessboard.
Well, it's also, it's worth stressing that hospitals are protected by the Geneva Conventions. The Geneva Conventions say that medical care, even for combatants, is protected. And so to bomb hospitals is a war crime. But Putin and Assad, the Syrian president, are essentially pursuing the so-called total war approach, where they're just going to kind of devastate the other side. Who cares about the Geneva Conventions? And bombing hospitals means that an injured combatant can't get treated. And so even though the Geneva Conventions say that you're entitled to that medical care, they're just attacking it. And the war has been fought this way all the way along. Assad and now Putin are notorious for attacking medical care. So that's one big issue.
Okay.
You mentioned Saudi Arabia, and there's Saudi Arabia at home is a problem because Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince, portrays himself as a social reformer, but he wants all of this reform to be dictated from on high. And so, for example, he gave women the right to drive, but the women's rights activists who sought the right to drive are in prison because they demanded that right rather than waiting for the benevolent dictator to give it to them.
Okay.
And so there is...
everything's on his terms.
It's all on his terms, so there's a complete crackdown on independent journalism. That's why Khashoggi was murdered, on any kind of human rights or civic activism. So domestically, in political terms, it's horrible.
He's also cracking down on his own people, his own heads of industry, and
Well, he notoriously
locked them up.
He locked people up in the Ritz-Carlton.
The Ritz-Carlton, right?
And essentially, said, you hand over half of your fortune, or you don't get out of here.
Sounds like a Putin move.
Yes, and it's so he got many billions that way. But the worst thing he's done has been in Yemen. And Yemen today is the world's worst humanitarian crisis. There are between 11 and 13 million Yemeni civilians who are dependent on humanitarian aid. Many of them are on the brink of famine. And this is because the Saudi-led coalition has been over and over bombing civilians, hitting mosques, markets, in one case a school bus. And they've been blockading by air and sea the entire northwestern part of Yemen. And this is, it's a complete disaster.
And Iran is involved as well, we think.
Iran is backing the so-called Houthis, who
Right.
are the rebel force in that part of Yemen who are fighting against the Saudis.
And this recent General Suleiman was kind of involved that with the Quds force, and it's a proxy war there between those two.
Qassam Soleimani was, I mean, certainly it supported the Houthi in Yemen, but I think what he was more known for was his support for Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Shia militia that are operating in Iraq and also to some extent in Syria.
Yeah.
And so he had a long history of supporting proxies who would, sometimes attack U.S. troops, would sometimes attack Israel. And so that was, really why he was targeted.
Okay.
But,
so this Yemen crisis is major.
The
Again,
Yemen crisis,
not being talked about as much.
Well, I mean, what's interesting is that because these are blatant war crimes, the Saudis have come under real pressure. And Saudi Arabia is another government that, Western governments are reluctant to stand up to because it has so much money. And they all want to sell arms and so forth. But
and oil for a trading partner, it's hard to...
Yes.
Although,
I mean, Saudi Arabia has to sell the oil, so it's not as if criticizing Saudi Arabia means they're going to cut off their oil sales to you. But it's more that they want the Saudi purchases.
Okay.
So but the pressure has begun to have an effect. So the Saudi-led coalition involves the Saudis bombing, but the Emiratis, the United Arab Emirate forces, recently, about 6 months ago, announced that they're pulling out of this coalition. And clearly the heat was getting to be too much for them. Sudan, which had been providing 20,000 troops, this new post-revolution government in Sudan, also announced that it was pulling out. So increasingly the Saudis are on their own. They can bomb away. They have no ground troops to speak of. And so they are in some trouble there. And the Yemen crisis continues, but there is a sliver of hope there that the Saudis will have to sue for some kind of peace agreement because they've lost the capacity in any sense to win this war against the Houthis.